It's low-key disgusting what Jesus did here. If there's anybody who knows what sufferation is as a people, it is us here in the Caribbean. Hi everyone, Angelo here. I'm a creative and a theologian, and it's the 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. So we're still in chapter 7 of Mark, and we have Jesus taking this roundabout way and passing through the Decapolis region. And then the people brings him a deaf man who also has a speech impediment and asks Jesus to lay hands on the man. So then Jesus pulls the person off to the side and he sticks his fingers in the person's ear, touches their tongue with spit, and the person is healed, right? But he uses this word in particular, ephphatha. Well, hopefully that's how you pronounce it. But what it means is to be opened. And the man was healed. And he tells everybody, typical of Mark fashion, he tells everybody, don't say nothing to nobody. And then, of course, typical of Mark fashion, they go and say everything to everybody. Excuse me. So this word that Mark uses, ephphatha, right? For me, it is special in particular because it is a rite that we perform in RCIA. But I will speak a little bit more about RCIA later on. But if we think about it, right, it's low-key disgusting what Jesus did here. I mean, I don't know in general if anybody else, at least nowadays, how they would feel about if another person did that to them. And yet that's what it took for healing. And I really don't think that the man was upset as to how Jesus would have healed him, how the method would have worked. But I imagine too that this is how Genesis was as well. This reminds me of Genesis and the second creation story, where God, when he formed us out of clay, then breathed life into us. I imagine it was probably very similar. So it's the same thing too, like whenever we meet Christ, like something I would often say, when we meet Christ, we move different. And when we meet Christ, it is a new beginning. But the thing is, when we meet Christ, we are not called to keep it a secret and keep that to ourselves, but rather, just like the people would have done in this story here, we are called to spread the good news and to spread the gospel. But it's interesting though that the story never said if the person himself, if he then went out to spread the good news. So who knows, maybe he listened to what Jesus had to say. But it seems like it was the people who brought the man to Jesus. It seemed like it was his, well, presumably friends, but it seems like they were the ones who then started to spread the message and the healing and salvific work of Christ. But as we know, Mark, one of the themes in Mark is this idea of the messianic secret. And also, as you might remember, the time when Mark was writing and the community Mark was writing for, it was a persecuted people. These people, they made sure to hide most of them and they tried to lay low. And we can't blame them, I mean, given everything that would have been going on. But I think it does go to show, this story goes to show the importance of witnessing God's work, not just in our own selves, as much as that is important, but also in others, because none of the people themselves would have been the one who were physically healed. It was the person that they brought to Christ that was physically healed. And through that physical healing, they were then inspired to spread the message of the good news. But it is also that God heals others and not in ways that we would expect. Because even though the story has it here that Jesus would have healed the person of his deafness and his speech impediment, the thing is they asked Jesus to lay hands on him. And I suppose you could say, yes, Jesus did, but he did more than that as well. And people wouldn't necessarily know the exact methods as to how Jesus would have healed. They just know that the man was healed. So, the thing is, this man was probably so down and helpless too. I mean, God knows how many years he would have been suffering like this. And because Jesus would have taken this roundabout way to pass through, this is why the man was healed. It wasn't a typical way, but yet this is how the man was healed. And I'm not one to glorify suffering or to try to add any extra value onto it. But the reality is, for better or for worse, suffering is a part of our human experience. It does exist. And the thing is, if there's anybody who knows what suffering is as a people, it is us here in the Caribbean. Just like this man know what suffering is, and the people at the time would have known what suffering is. That's obviously one of the major things that Christ would have brought healing to in the region. We here in the Caribbean region, we know what suffering is in a very deep and visceral way as well. But yet, we hope, we persevere, we rise as a Caribbean people. And Christ comes into our lives and he opens us up. And Christ enters into our lives and he brings healing to all of us. And it reminds me a little bit of that viral Kamala Harris quote that is going around recently, where it says, what she says, if you are fortunate enough to have opportunities, it is your duty to make sure other people have those opportunities as well. Excuse me. But in the same way that Christ would have taken this roundabout way, I feel like we should be taking more roundabout ways in our lives as well. Change up the routine a little bit and do less of what we typically known to do, even for our own selves. And, do more things just simply for the hell of it. And I mean, this advice is probably for me more than anybody else listening. But I do think it is important that we live a life full of experiences, that we open up our ears and we open up our eyes. Because the same way that Christ came and brought healing to this man, Christ comes and he brings healing to us too. So, as the body of Christ, it is up to us then to continue that healing work and to bring healing to others. And however we do that in our own way as individuals is only for us to discern. But getting back to this idea of RCIA. RCIA candidates in particular go through a lot of roundabout ways to meet Christ. And I mean, I could say this because, well, as many of you would know, I am an RCIA catechist. And every year, the way we always start is we ask, what brought you here? And some of these stories, if not mostly stories, that RCIA candidates tell are nothing less than mind-blowing. I believe we should have a collection of RCIA candidate stories. Because just like the people in the Decapolis, they would recognize God's healing and saving work in this man. If there's anybody who has an inspiring story, and if there's anybody who a person needs to look to recognize God's healing and saving work, it is an RCIA candidate. To all the RCIA catechists too, big up, because your work is meaningful, your work is valuable, and I do think it is a great privilege and honor that we get to journey with candidates and help them get to know Christ for their own selves. I mean, personally, I owe a lot to being an RCIA catechist, and I owe a lot to the roundabout ways that I've taken in my life. And the reason I mention this is because just like I would like for us to be able to recognize God in the other, I would also like for us to look at our own selves too as individuals, for us to look at our own stories, again, especially for us here in the Caribbean, for us to look at our own life stories and recognize the way that God works in our lives. Because in the moment it might be difficult, but we always say hindsight is 2020, and in retrospect, I do think it is a little bit easier to look back and recognize how God might work in and through our lives. And the thing is, that whole retrospect is not simply to feel good, but rather, more than that, it is to acknowledge the goodness and greatness of God. And at least I think it also makes it a little bit easier to have faith. Because the same way we could struggle through all our suffering, just as a Christian people, we attribute that to God. And we can look to God and say, God has taken me through all of this, and God will take me through anything that I am going through as well. So keep hope and trust in God. And when it's time, be opened. Anyways, that's it from me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.